Okay guys, so this is the first video of a series that I'm starting. I don't know what I'm gonna call it, Juan Thoughts or something like that. Anyhow, it doesn't matter. So what I'm trying to create is a space for myself to get my ideas out. Ideas that are not necessarily about fitness, nutrition, like mindset and the regular topics that I talk about. They can be about that, but they're not necessarily. And the objective really is just to give myself a selfish space in which I just get my ideas out, because what happens to me is I will get ideas that sometimes I put into written form or something, but I don't get out, right? And I just want to have that for myself. As I try to always do, I will make them useful in some way, like do something with them, not just spit my guts, but like just make it useful. And I'm gonna try to make it useful for you, the imaginary viewer that I don't know if it really exists or is YouTube just telling me that they are abusing my videos and it's all a lie. But I'm gonna try to make it useful to you with the purpose that it will become then useful to me, right? It's a little bit of a selfish thing. Anyhow, so let me, the topic of this first one will be very clear in a second, but it's what I will call the beginning. So let me start at the beginning. 1.5 years ago, I was diagnosed with autism. And so this started one day. I was browsing through Netflix, and Hannah Gadsby, who is a tremendously awesome Australian comedian, had just released Douglas, a new Netflix comedy special. And I had watched the previous one, Nanette, and it had hit me really hard. It's a really good show. I highly recommend you watch it. But this one, it was her and it had a dog, and so I naturally was like, I have to watch this. And I told Emma, we have to watch this, and she was like, yeah, of course. And so we started watching it, and one of the first things she says is that she has autism, and that she's gonna talk about that in the show. And it's funny because she says that right away, and it should be kind of the punchline of the show, but it wasn't, and she just throw it there, and she makes a whole deal out of it. It's not the only topic of the show, of course, but she goes and explains. Anyhow, it doesn't matter. You watch that show. It's very awesome. That special. It's very, very, very funny and very awesome. The thing is that after I watched it, and after it finished, my brain was going hard because I identified with the thing at so many levels. So the first thing that I tried to do was I talked to Emma, my wife, and I was like, listen, the way she wrote that is exactly how I would have written that same thing. The way she describes how her brain works is exactly how my brain works, even though she's a graphical thinker and I'm a textual thinker. I think in words, I think in narratives, I think in formal languages. She thinks graphically, but the way she describes her brain is the same. And the life experiences that she was describing was very close to, they feel very personal to me. And so I was going and trying to explain this to Emma, trying to explain how this, this connection was strong, and she, who's a very sensible human, was understanding. And also yeah, Juan, it's right. Sometimes we'll feel like that with different pieces of artwork or whatever. Anyhow, I went in and started. I have never thought about autism before, never ever. I didn't know what, I had the same prejudiced idea that all of us had probably, and I never have learned about it or done anything with it, which is outstanding, because I was a teacher for so long and a coach for so long, and I feel like you should know the different neurological realities of humans. Anyhow, I did it. So I started researching, and what I was finding out is that the life experience of these people that were diagnosed with autism when they were adults felt really close to my experience. Very, very, very close. I was like, yeah, I understand this. I do this. Yes, this is yes. And so I was like, I have to just to to research this, I have to talk to somebody about this, somebody that knows about this thing. And so I went and found a doctor, a specialist that specializes in autism for adults. And when I talked with him, he decided, after a conversation and an initial assessment, that there was enough evidence to kind of do a more serious assessment. And because I'm great at tests, I pass all the tests because there's 700, and different medical associations, different psychological associations have different tests, and in all of them I score autistic. And so I was diagnosed, and so there it was. It was very, very strange in some ways. So I don't want to explain, what is autism. I couldn't, even if I wanted, in just one video. And I don't want to go through, and that's probably very interesting to you right now, I imagine, especially if you know me. I imagine you have a lot of questions, but just curiosity, of course. Not that I'm super interesting, but just curiosity. But I'm not gonna go through the whole thing. I'll keep it to an aspect, and I want to get to a point at the end of the video, and an idea that's been getting in my head, because, as I said, this is about ideas that I want to get out. Anyhow, so a little bit of history here. So one aspect of autism, and let me track it back a little bit. So probably before we go there, one thing that you probably experience right now is a little bit of cognitive dissonance, which is when a preconceived idea that we have doesn't coincide with reality, and we just clash. This doesn't make any sense, and that probably is coming in your head in the form, but Juan, you look so normal. And that clash, I understand it. I lived through it too. I had cognitive dissonance about this thing too, in some ways. There's an easy way to solve that problem. That is, if I told you, I'm a high functioning autist, and so you'll be like, okay. I don't like that term, and I'll tell you why. Because what you're experiencing there, when you're you look so normal, whatever it is that you're experiencing, I'm speculating here, it is the clash between a preconception of what you thought was autistic and a reality, one is autistic, and what the clash is the clash should go something what I thought was autism is not, it doesn't look like autism at all, versus being attaching to that feeling, to that belief, autism look like this, and the way to not let go of that is by saying Juan, it's just that Juan is a little bit normal, and you kind of patch the thing so you can hold on to your belief that autism is whatever it is that you believe, and you don't have to let go of that dissonance and be that makes sense. It's just that he is autistic, but he's a little bit different, so that makes sense. No. It's just that what you know of autism is not much, and certainly what you thought it was is not the whole picture. And deal with that. Just deal with that. I had to deal with that. I'm not judging you or anything. I was the first person to be in the situation was me. I had no idea of anything, right? And so I just wanted to start with that. And since we're there, and this is gonna be a topic important for this video, I love the term Aspie from Asperger's syndrome, which is related to the way in which autism is a label that marks a neurological life experience, a way to experience the world, and so there's 700 different ways to be autistic in the world, and Asperger's adds a little bit of complexity. It's a subset, and I like it because it sounds cool. You're an Aspie, so I'm an Aspie. Anyhow, so that's the first thing. So now I want to talk two things. One, I want to highlight one of the aspects of autism that is important to me, and for this video I want to talk a little bit about how the transition for me was brutal and fundamental, and then what am I gonna do with that, and how is that useful for something more than just one's inner life experience, right? And so the first thing, the aspect of autism that was more deep to me, and that was the one that I identified the hardest, the most, There's 700 other aspects that I'm not touching today, but I identified deeply, just that I weren't aware of them until I saw them. But this one was very clear, and is that social interactions for me were impossible in some ways, right? Like, and so I grew up thinking that I was shy, but that was never a good way to classify, like, to understand my approach. But and it didn't explain very well how I felt in the world. But I knew that socially there was something off with me. I never understood social relationships, right? And so you might be thinking about, like, what the fuck? I was a teacher since I was 21 years old, and I am, you know, like, always here talking on videos and coaching people and so on. So for me, let me explain it this way. For me, social interactions in which the rules and roles are clear, and this is the experience of most Aspies out there. I'm just, you know, like, telling you my own experience, but this is the shared thing. For me, like, those contexts in which the rules are clear are awesome. I thrive, right? Like, so if I'm teaching a class, I thrive because I know exactly what my role is. And, you know, like, that probably feels very familiar to you, no matter who you are. You're like, yeah, that makes total sense. You know, like, the thing is that when those rules are not clear, which is the rest of their life, when, you know, like, and when those rules haven't been explained to me, I don't have a clue on how to identify the rules. Most people just learn them by just being, right? Like, just like you pick up a language. I didn't pick up that language. I don't. But moreover is that when those rules are not clear or are ambiguous, I feel threatened. Let me explain that. I'm walking on the street, I see a person, an athlete that's been working with me for the past 3 years. It's a relationship in which I only know how to interact in this setting of coaching. As soon as I'm out of that setting, I don't know what to do. I've known this person for 3 years. In my inner, you know, like, it's that's the part that you probably are like, that's a little bit weird. You know, like, we have talked for so long, so many hours out on my feelings and so on, and as soon as you're out of context and I'm just walking my dogs and I'm seeing you, I get awkward. I don't know what to do. And what happens in my physiology, and this is the interesting part, and this is probably the part that doesn't happen to everybody and happen more to Aspies, is I go into flight or fight mode. It's not that I am, like, annoyed, it's that I get scared, it's that I get uncomfortable and I want to run and hide. That is the part. And the more unknown the relationship, the context is, and the more social the context is, the more I want to run and hide. And that run and hide is really strong. So it's strong to the point that I will find myself doing tremendous amounts of things to avoid these kind of small interactions. Sometimes very consciously, sometimes I'm like, why am I doing this? Right? And so, and that becomes very frightening in your life, and so on. And I realized one of the things that was very important in my life, I'll go back a little bit more too late, earlier in my life, but one of the things that was very important in my life that made me understand this very well, how did my brain work, was going back to my process of immigration to the United States. So when I moved to the United States, I felt awesome, and I have learned to understand why it felt so awesome, and it was because the rules of social interactions were explained to me over and over by, there were structures in the university where I was, which was the University of Chicago, and there were institutionalized ways in which the process of acculturation was explicit. This is how things work. This is how you talk. This is what is expected from you. When you're native in a culture, in a society, those things are not explained to you. You pick them up. I never had that when I was a kid, and so I always grew up in an adversarial position in the world with a set of rules that I didn't understand, but I saw people like my sister, like my best friend, understanding that very well and feeling like I was very fucking weird. Not that there was just that there was something crazy about me, right? That something wasn't functioning very well, because what they seem to do very naturally, and this is it was just a feeling. I couldn't put words into it, because I didn't know what was happening. Now I know what was happening. I can put words into it. I can understand it. But before I couldn't. It was just a feeling of like, these people can't do these things, like And so the only thing you can translate that to is like, I'm fucking crazy. And crazy not in the sense that like I'm eccentric, really crazy as like, like there's something a little bit off, and you start going in a confirmation bias aspect. But anyhow, when I moved to the US, that was a great experience for me, because that happened, and on the top of that, the American culture is a culture that is very conventional and that loves standards. Conventional in the sense that love conventions, not in the sense that it's ordinary, and that was amazingly useful to me, because I had friends even, like it was not just the university that had all these mechanisms to help immigrants with all these rules that societies have and that you are never taught really, but it also like friends, friends that were immigrants and that were like going through the process were teaching me these rules. But also American friends, like I have this very cool friend, very close friend, who actually introduced me to my wife, that will teach me how to speak, basically, not the language, not the pronunciation, but how would you say hi, how wouldn't you say hi, like like I couldn't pick up those things needed to be explained to me, how like how would you ask a woman for a phone number, right? Like all those things needed to be explained to me, and I needed them to be very formulaic. So I hope that explains a little bit of the thing, right? Like, and so that social aspect for me, those rules were, like I if you throw me out of context, of a context that is familiar, I don't know what to do. If you throw even context with known people, but that are unfamiliar with that unknown people, then I don't know what to do, and I go into a very physiological response to that. I just don't have the tools. Now I do better, right? Like I have learned, but it's a fake. Like it's not a fake. It's a learned process. It's not intuitive at any point. There's $700 aspects, and like we could talk about masking and facial expressions, and how like all this discussion about social and like the rules means also that like if it were on me, I would talking like this all the time, and I wouldn't gesticulate and move my hands a lot, and that's just learned. And I have learned that if I don't do that, people don't understand me at all, and you will be surprised of how many times I have had lost in translation moments, because if I'm not paying attention, I'm monotone, and that's where I thrive. Anyhow, so that is the aspect that was the most big for me. That was like that made my life more characteristic. That I was picking up of the Aspie thing. Now I have picked a lot of different things that are also there that are important, but that was the thing that was hitting me harder when I realized this, and that I was explaining more, because it was the thing that had hit my life harder, that I had struggled with all my life. Like I always felt like I left my country because I was in this adversarial situation with a society that I didn't really understand, and escaping is not a good feeling, right? And so one of the things that I, like, let me just round this discussion. One of the maladaptive coping mechanism that I created to deal with this aspect, just one of the aspects of the Aspie thing, was either to use social crutches. So I use my friends to help me with the social aspect that I couldn't do on my own. And that was unfair to them, because they didn't know that what I was doing, I didn't either. And I always, for example, felt like a drag to them. Like they had to like drag me into these social things and help me, and they didn't make me feel like that. It just, like it was this weird thing, and they were really crutches. I would use them because if I didn't know what I was doing, right? And so That was one aspect that was always hard, and the other aspect is that anytime that I had to socialize and so on, I would get drunk or high, and it was the only way I could do it. Because, and I have come to realize, I will get drunk, because then any eccentricity of me could have been explained. And so that was very comforting to me. I could be, like, let's be fucking weird, it doesn't matter, like that's what you do. And when I was getting high, it allowed me to be closed and not talk, which was actually more comforting to me. Like, I felt a lot better there. Anyhow, so those coping mechanisms weren't very good, right? Like, they work only till they didn't. And so anyhow, so that aspect was very, very, very hit me really hard, right? Like, it was very deep in my persona. And the last way that I actually solved that problem was I came to the conclusion, after years of like writing and studying and so on, that the purpose of human life was to realize that no matter what you did, no matter how close you got in your relationships, and like at this point I was already married and so on. Well, I wasn't, but I was getting about to, or again, I had very close relationships. No matter what you did, you were always going to be alone. You were alone in this world. That was at the end, like, and I don't want to walk you through all the things, but that's how I felt. And it wasn't a depressing thought, it wasn't sad, it was just what I believed. It was that you were detached from the world no matter what. And that's not what I believe at all. I think the human experience, the human being cannot be isolated. You cannot understand humans in isolation no matter what. You cannot understand humans without the element of where we live, right? Like, I don't think that there's a boundary between ourselves and where like the rest, right? Like, we cannot do that. Anyhow, but that was how I was living, right? Like, and that's where I was ending. And so the first thing that happened when I was diagnosed with autism was understanding a little bit of that, right? Like, that helps immensely. So the first, now let me transition to the transition. So let me talk about that. So the first thing that happened to me when I was diagnosed with Asperger's or with autism was that I felt very relieved, because suddenly I wasn't crazy. And suddenly a lot of things make a lot of sense. But on the other hand, I hit a lot of sadness and fear. On the one hand, because then, like, this label comes with the kind of, it comes with like disability and disease in it. Like, it comes like, and it doesn't have to be like that. Like, that was just my prejudice, and I don't interpret it like this anymore. But that was how I was seeing it, right? Like, and lack, right? And so, and then the fear was just a natural consequence of that, right? Like, and I was very afraid that when I would say like, hey, like, this is a little bit who I am, and remember all those, like, talk with my friends, and remember that thing that I do, that when I get into one thing, I go all in till there's nothing else to learn, and I stay there for years, and then suddenly I'm done with it, and I go to another thing, I do the same thing, remember that, and then everything else apart from that goes to hell. Remember that? Yeah, that's very Aspie. And like, and I could do that with like many other aspects of my life that I do that are like very Aspie, and that would explain a lot to my friends. And so that part will be funny, but the fear part came from, like, at the professional, personal level, the fear part comes from, because it's still there, from how people will experience me, right? Like, how the value of my words and the value of my ideas and the value of my thoughts will change. And I know that that's unavoidable, because that's how we work. That's how we work, right? Like, and it's unfortunate, but it is also necessary in some ways, right? Like, it's never just black or white, and never just good or bad, right? But there was that fear, right? Like, in which now I was gonna be understood under this lens, and I was automatically put into this category, and that was going to mean that my words were gonna be interpreted like that, and they were gonna be categorized as crazy. So at one point, in the same sense, I was like happy that I wasn't crazy, and like I was this person that was like something off, loquito de la casa. But on the other hand, I was like, okay, that explains a lot. But now when I come out, like people is gonna be like, oh, I have to understand all these things that is used as saying like different. And I know that's gonna happen. It has happened, and it will continue to happen. But that's all right. That is all right. And that fear and that discussion of that transition is what led me to really think about labels, right? Like and I have thought about labels for the longest time, and like my whole thesis was about that, and I have always like it's not, I'm not the first person to think about that. Like Foucault created this unit of discourse idea that is like really how our brains understood that, like like our brains don't work in isolation. Your ideas are not your ideas. Your ideas are language ideas, and language lives in a society, and our ideas are connected to other people's ideas, right? Like your brain again doesn't work in isolation. And so unit of discourses is this idea from Foucault in which, like, when you say whatever autism, there's this mass of discourse that is really what it is, autism, right? It's this mass of ideas, textual ideas, recording and so on. This video that you're seeing is gonna go up into a cloud. Like, if you understand, like, Foucault would love the internet because the internet will be the materialization of that. The cloud is like the best graphical way to understand that. And so, like, I've been thinking, and my thesis was on the printing press and so on. My dissertation was on the printing press and so on. So I've been thinking about labels at all, but the problem that I was identifying there was like more personal, more identitarian. It's like, now I'm gonna start identifying myself with this label, and what does that mean, and what does a label do, and how does that change my relationship with the world? And that's a very interesting discussion to me, because like the first thing that I did was like, okay, does this label make any sense? Right? Like, am I gonna start identifying myself with this label? Is this a solid construction, like a construct, right? Like, is this based on valid evidence, or I'm just like calling myself a label that is not going to be useful in 5 years, right? And so I started researching on that. I have come to the conclusion that this is a very valid label. It's a very valid construct. Of course, as we gather more data on the world, we'll refine it and make it a lot more interesting and a lot more nuanced and a lot more, that we'll understand now the big breadth of neurological experience, and it will not be so binary as like, here's the Aspies and here's the neurotypicals, right? Like, or like these little sets. But it made me think like how labels and identities are important, and it made me solve a lot of problems for myself. Because hear me out. So when I'm attaching to that label, what I'm actually doing is like looking at this experience, a set of experiences that are very painful to me in a way, or happy, or whatever, and I'm labeling and are shared with others that have those same experiences, and I'm saying like, hey dudes, we all have seen this, and I identify with those shared experiences, right? Like, I feel your pains, I've been there, and so I can relate to that. And so in that sense, that label is part of who I am, and so it attaches value to me, right? And so in that sense, the label is very useful to me. It allows me to explain this shared experience, right? Like, it allows me to understand it. It allows me to not live in isolation. It allows me to explain it to you. It allows me those so many things. But in other ways, it's very oppressing. It's very problematic. Because it can be simplified and it can be definitive, right? Like, you can become in jail by that label, and I think all labels work like that. And so one of the conclusions and one of the things that I have started to think, and it was a recurring idea, is and this is, I think, is very useful, is how labels divide society in particular topologies. So think about race in the US. The fact that people define themselves by race, and the majority of people does, so that like the rest of the people have to, defines a particular kind of society. And those sets are open in the sense that what's the border, the frontier of the set. So if you take the set of white people, you know who is definitely not white. I am not white because I wasn't born Anglo-Saxon in the US and I have mixed blood, right? And so that automatically puts me out. And anybody knows when they are not. But there's you can get as close to the frontier as you can. Right? Like you can be more French or German or whatever. You can walk there. You can and it's even more open if you move to, for example, non-white. Like let's think black. Like the frontier is very clear. Who is not black? Very, very clear. But the people in the set is open because you can get as close to the frontier without actually touching it, right? So if like your grandmother is black and you have lived some of these experiences of that, you can get as close to the frontier but never be there, right? And so labels and identity and societal labels divide societies in those topologies, and I'm using the word topology not freely. I'm not going to explain what a topology is very well right now because it's a complex mathematical concept, but the basic idea is if you have a set, you can, depending on how you divide it, you get different properties, right? Like, so the same set of numbers divided in different open sets give you different geometrical spaces. That's the best way I can describe it. And so, for example, the Colombian society where I come from is a society that you could divide in terms of races, but that wouldn't work very well because people really identify themselves with classes. Most people believe they're mixed. Of course, there's people for whom race is a very identitarian thing, and I cannot talk about everybody's experience, but most people define themselves as mixed. And so the topology of the society is really that of a class society, and those sets operate like races in the US in the sense that there's a very clear border, right? That is clear. You can, if you're here, you're not here, right? There's a very clear border, but they're open in the sense that you can get as close to that border without actually touching it. Always more closer. And so, and class is that. So you are more high class or less high class, like more rich or more poor. And that's how that topology and that society is divided. And one of the things that I've been seeing in the past years and so on is that one of the main things, and I feel that in my experience with the Aspie label, and it wasn't clear to me until that, is that the problem with one of the main problems with societies is that when we need to change the topology of the society, but are not able to change to let the label to change the label, because if we don't change, if you don't change the identity that you belong to this set, the society is going to be defined by that topology, and it's kind of determined. That is the important thing of using that mathematical concept. So if you divide your set in a particular society, the rules are defined by the society, by the topology, and we can prove that mathematically. And so one of the things that all this discussion, and I know this is gray and whatever, but again, this was just to share my ideas. One of the things that this has made me think is like, how do I approach this label thing? How do I approach it for myself? And I think that's useful. It can be useful in this more broader complex web of how to attach to certain labels. And I know that my experience is very limited, and I know that like people that participates in other groups and that belongs to those other groups and those other labels will define themselves differently, and for them, like what I'm going to say can be violent, but I'll say it comes because like I'm open for discussion. But the important thing is to not let the label define the set. So just because the label can define, because when I attach the label to these shared experiences, doesn't mean that label is going to define the rest of my experiences back. And so it's not identitarian in that sense. And that is how I have solved this problem for myself, right? Like, so yes, of course, most of my experiences are Aspie's experience, and I share that. But is those experiences And that is related to the way I interact with the world. And that is the way that maybe my brain and my physiology work, of course. And maybe I can label those things like that, and that can help me with other experiences. But I don't have to define my role in society and let that label define me back, right? I don't have to let the border becomes hard and untranspassable, and I don't have to live here. And that doesn't mean giving up those experiences, right? And so I'm saying that, and that's important because those experiences, in my case, in a very limited way, are violent and aggressive, or like in the sense that like they led to loneliness, they led to like alienation, they led to all these things. In the case of other people, those labeling and experiences can have led to violent aggression, also, you know, like oppression and so many different, way more difficult things, right? And so you cannot not share those experiences and label them. So the label is important in that sense, but it shouldn't define you. Like, it doesn't define the rest of your experience, and that is fundamental, because then you don't have, your role in society doesn't have to be defined by that topology. And that way, in terms, will make that the society is not defined by that topology. And I think that's important. And I think the concept of topology, I'm butchering there, but I think if there's a mathematician out there that is hearing this and that wanna go through it, like, let's go together. I would like to do the work of thinking if we can formalize that a little bit better, because I think there's something there. But anyhow, so I bet you didn't expect all of that, and I bet you that got a little bit weird there at the end. But I'll talk more about the Aspie thing. We can make fun things out there, but this is just the first video of many in which I share my thoughts. If you make it this far in this video, thank you so much. Really, I'm expecting that the only person that will go through this will be my son. One day when he gets really interesting, where did I come from? But apart from that, I don't expect anybody going through it. But if you did, my imaginary viewer, thank you so much. And here's to more interesting videos, and we'll talk more Aspie things and more things that are not Aspie at all. Thank you so much.